Today we will be painting some Boxdark Bretonnians using a black and yellow scheme. Many viewers have pointed out that they really look like a Mousillon army, and while not really intentional, I checked it out and yeah, it really fits the bill. This could pretty much be said to be a how to paint your Mousillon army tutorial. But the colors can obviously be exchanged for any other color you fancy. But I think it's best done if you do one bright and one darker color. They will be applied in a very simple way, you know, no airbrushes or any fancy stuff like that, and using a method that is streamlined enough to get you through an entire army worth of miniatures, while at the same time relaxed enough not to get you bored while doing it. And then these guys are Bretonnians, but you can obviously do it for any other old world troopers as well. I will be doing some Skaven, and they will be done exactly the same way. Or perhaps even similar, I don't know. Well, pretty much exactly the same way. But with all of that said, you know, this is how these guys are done. We start out base coating them all with a black rattle can. Pretty standard. Like the next step, which is a rattle can zenithal with a dark grey. It is common knowledge that black is rarely just black, and to give some room for the recesses to be black, something else needs to be, well, you know, not black. The next step will bring out the highlights, but we will also, you know, want some gradient in the midtones. And as it literally only takes a few seconds, this is the quickest way to do it. It will probably not be a surprise that the next step is a dry brush. While the dry brush in many ways follow all the general rules for a good dry brush, we break some of the basics by jumping straight to a brighter grey. This would make a mess if we were aiming for a smooth paint job, but as we're leaning towards sort of the Grimdark style here, this will actually be sort of an asset. Given what we later will do, a really smooth base coat is mainly a wasted effort. This is the fail-safe foundation of the miniature, and it gives us the confidence not to worry if something is left out at a later stage. Trust me, with this foundation in place, no one will ever notice that part of an arm is left out at some point. Moving on, we do a quick overbrush with an off-white for all the areas that will be of any brighter color. Most things in this video are pretty common stuff, and I will not go into details as I assume that most viewers have already seen at least a few videos about it. To keep it short, I will try to only talk about the stuff where I actually have something specific to say. Like the overbrush, which is a bit of a lesser known technique, so let's do a short explanation. You load up your brush with a good deal of regular paint, and then swipe it once or twice at the paper towel, just so that any flowy color will leave the brush. You then paint the selected areas, pulling your brush from top to bottom. It is advisable to use a rather large brush and to paint at a sort of shallow angle. The result should be a mixture between a bad base coat and a failed dry brush, looking something like this. You might wonder, why not just do the ever so present zenithal? Zenithal with a rattle can is, regardless of what people say, not equivalent to a zenithal with an airbrush. I really dislike when tutorials actually using the zenithal says you can also do it with a rattle can. But I will do it with an airbrush because, you know, usually claiming some sort of convenience thing, which I suppose it is more convenient. It is like, you know, using your garden hose to clean your cat. Airbrushes can be used for smooth edges on parts of miniatures, as you have a fine nozzle and can adjust both pressure and flow. Rattle cans, on the other hand, are on or off, and they're precise enough to aim for, you know, one half of the miniature and the other will get stains. Don't get me wrong, I almost always do some kind of rattle can zenithal and find them immensely useful. But you will have to keep in mind that they are not the same. We want some specific areas to be brighter, and trying to do that with a rattle can will most likely ruin the other parts of the miniatures. following this foundation, it is time for the actual colors. The colors I use for this job is, well, obviously there is a black spray can. Chaos Black is a really nice one, but it doesn't have to be that specifically, obviously. It's the same thing with this sort of slate gray color. Any brand will do, any color will do. I think this one is actually called Stealth Discreet, I see now, but I say slate gray because that is probably what it's more commonly sold as. But this is a really good one as well. To that one we have a sort of bright and a bit warm gray. I really love this color. As you can see, this bottle has been through quite a lot. I think this one is called Stonewall Gray or something, perhaps Stone Gray. Anyway, it's a Vallejo color, doesn't really matter. It's a bright warm gray, anyone will do. It's used for the dry brushing, if I'm not clear about that. Then we also got an off-white. Same thing here, brand doesn't really matter. I prefer to have not a pure white when doing sort of overbrushing and stuff like that. Just, you know, in case, just to keep some warmth in there, because I think that is more nice. And it will also be used for all kinds of bones and stuff like that. So that's why it's also very nice to have a not very cold one, a bit warmer. Because we also got a bone white that has survived, even though I mix most of my colors myself now. And I just love it. It's just a very versatile color. This time we will be using it for skin tone. And it's actually really nice as a base for the unhealthy looking skin tones. It got a bit of yellow in it, and you will see later how it works. Then we got two browns. I usually, as I stated, I usually mix my colors myself from primaries and a few oxides, but you know, and anyone who has graduated from kindergarten will know that brown is the easiest color to mix. But still, you know, painting an entire army, I decided that I would cut some corners, and I actually bought 2 pots of brown. When you paint sort of low fantasy style, or whatever you call it, you quickly end up with 10 shades of brown or 50 shades of brown, whatever. It's a lot of browns. And I think you could actually get another one in between these, or perhaps one with a slightly color variation as well. But I think the minimum is to have 2 at least, so you can have 2 brown things next to each other without looking like, well, actually you can tell which one is which one. But 2 of them will do, and it's the same thing here. The main thing is the one is dark and one is bright. Then we got an off green, or a pale green, and it's the same thing here, you know. I've managed more than a year without any sort of green colors in my possession. But for an entire army, basing out 100 bases, close to 100 bases, and it's probably not even gonna show as itself, you know. It's not really worth sitting there mixing these colors. I will just use this one, buy one and use it. It's the same thing here, you know, like brand and the actual specific color doesn't really matter. The yellow used is an oxide yellow. I think this one is from Chimera because it says so on the bottle. And I just love the oxides. It's the same thing here. It's a bit, you know, warm, and it's a bit like an off yellow, but still kind of intense. So it is really nice, and it conveys a sort of worn look as well. As a metal, I will be using this one. It's Vallejo Air Metal. I think I got a lot of a bigger bottle somewhere else, and I filled it up. Just have a small one. This one is a really nice one. It's really bright, though, you might think, for doing sort of dark stuff, but it will get muted down, and this one is really nice to use with. Even though it really eats through brushes like nothing else, you know, it has a really nice flow, which also means it gets up into the little area where, I don't remember what it's called, the little area where you keep your bristles together. And it really destroys them because there's a lot of metal in here, but it's just so nice. Then the last color, we obviously got the oil black oil. I use an oxide here as well, because as stated I really love the oxides, but I also happen to have a rather large tube of it, so that's probably a main reason as well. You can probably do with any sort of black, might even be better with the regular black, who knows. But I really like this one because it's a sort of an off black, if that's a thing. Finally, there will be a few pigments in there as well. It doesn't really specifically have to be these. These are the ones I actually use with this one. It's a burnt umber, because I mean brown is, as stated earlier, there's brown everywhere. We got ochre rust, a yellowish one, whatever, and a greenish one for things that look a bit moldy or something like that. And then the brown or iron oxide. I think this is the main one. It's going to be used the most, because it is a nice trade-off between a bright color and, well, not a bright color actually. So it's a really useful one. I think this one is the main one I will be using. So, color-wise, that's it. Even if you do a really dark scheme, you want to have some colors that go all the way to high value and full color. It serves two purposes. Without it, the brain will read most miniatures as unfinished. You will need some colors to show that you did not just forget about them. And in a very similar way, you need some bright and colorful values to tell the brain how dark the other parts actually are. And don't worry at this stage if things look way too bright. It is so easy to dial them down. We apply the colors in two thin coats, but it's not the regular two thin coats. Once again, the reason is twofold. First off, getting a bit of thin color in the wrong spot is not a big deal. This enables you to relax and bring up the speed quite a bit. When looking at the way we paint today, it might seem that it will take a lot of time and the traditional slap shop would be much faster. But all of these and the following steps have a rather high, tolerance for imperfections. Painting in this way, in like this seriously carefree way, can be really fast. As you can tell, I'm actually able to use a rather large brush when I'm doing this. The other thing is that when you come around the second time, you only apply it to, the color to the highlights, or sort of rough highlights at least, and we get another quick and easy transition. The only exception, at least in my case, is the metallics. I happen to use a Vallejo Air Silver, and its flow and coverage is so great that it will end up with one solid coat at the first pass. However, you sort of try, you can dry brush it, but pretty much solid in the first run. It's not a huge deal though. Just like any other kind of work, it's a trade-off between effort and control. I prefer to have a color that is easy to work with. As mentioned earlier, it will get dialed down later anyway. We paint the base in whatever color is appropriate for the ground, in this case green. This is for the very same reason as the miniature has sort of black with a bit of grey in it all over the place, or foundation. It's the same thing here. If you miss some sort of basing down at the, base, it's not a big deal, it will be green anyway. Also later when we put the grass on, it will look more natural if there is some sort of greenish tone beneath, because otherwise sometimes you can get some black showing and it will, it not look nice. At this stage, you might opt to bring out a selection of other colors, just to hunt through the lot looking for things like a pouch or a turnip or whatever that could have a deviating color. It is by no means necessary, but you should, it should only take a few minutes, and it will really help to convey the impression that it is a complete paint job. Now, the entire miniature has a good variety of shades and colors. The finish might not be top-notch at this stage. Don't look too close because they actually look pretty crappy, but don't worry. It is time to drench it all in black oil and tie it all together, and quite honestly hide many of the small imperfections that have arisen along the way. It is also very fun. There are, however, a few things that can ruin your experience. The first is the consistency of the oil color. I suppose it is easier to get a nice thin coverage using an airbrush, but for us with no airbrush, getting the consistency right is the key for a good oil experience. I usually get the best result when I pretty much rub it in dry, or as dry as, oil colors get, sort of straight out of the tube. It is, however, the slowest process, and it is hard to get into the recesses. The other extreme is to thin it down, closer to a wash. But if you want to leave the Boxdark behind, you want some larger parts to be pure or almost pure black. It also increases the risk that it will stay wet, and suddenly when you do some final touches it will bleed in all over the place. Very annoying. The whole ratio thing takes a bit of experience, but I found the sweet spot to be when it remains on all areas, but you can still tell what color is beneath it, if that makes sense. Kind of like this. Most steps in this video can be done, a bit at a time. These guys have been painted up in small gaps throughout the entire week. But it's advisable to do the entire oil part in the same day. But at the same time, do you want them to dry up a bit as well? The best way to do this is to apply the oils, walk your dog, feed your kids, bake some bread or whatever you fancy, and then come back for the fun part. To clean the oils in a semi-controlled way. At first, it is often best to use a bit of cloth. I use an old sock of the brand Frank Dandy. I am pretty convinced that it doesn't really matter, but a piece of cloth is a good idea, because the advantage is that it can hold quite a bit of thinner and paint, while it also makes it possible to run the entire lot through, pretty quickly. Some people say that you will hurt your acrylic paint doing this, and others say you don't. My experience is that there is a certain risk of hurting your raised areas, but it almost only happens when you swipe or rub, especially with fabric. Therefore, I mainly dab and almost only swipe on flat areas. Then I never had any problems really. How much of the oil you will remove is also a factor. There is a risk of confusion, as it usually turns a bit dull and thus less vibrant when dry. A good aim is that there should be some areas on each part of the miniature that is pure black. When this is done, you take a Q-tip, dip it in white spirit, swipe it off, and look for features that you want to promote. Most often this is the head, hands and weapons, but it could also be some sort of emblem or special feature. Change the Q-tip as you seem fit. At this stage, I usually also keep a palette of oil colors ready, so that you can take a tip of whatever diluted color you fancy and introduce it as a tint. My experience is that without an airbrush it is hard to introduce tints later. This is a real advantage of the oil colors, as you have no troubles working with the colors while still wet. And then it will naturally blend with the shadows. You can also add a bit of highlights or shadows if you find some areas lacking, but all of this is obviously optional. If you have no oil colors and still want to do this, I suppose you can do it after drying, but then you have to listen to someone else because I have no experience there. A good example of this is the skin. I use bone white, which is sort of a yellowish white, as a foundation, and then I add a bit of mixture between blue and magenta, so I suppose it's violet or purple or something, and you introduce it and you rub it around a bit, and then you pretty much swipe it off, and you will see that it actually blends in with the black in the recesses and makes a nice sort of tint of skinish color or blood tint, or at least something that used to be blood. I don't know if these guys are dead or whatnot, but yeah, whatever. If you see the thing here, you introduce the tint. I'm not an expert on pigments either, but I do love them. The way we do them here, they are also preferably done while the oils are still not dry. This means that they will stick to the paint as individual pigments and thus look kind of rough, while still adding a bit of color gradient. It is most effective if applied on an area where you have kind of a large area of paint. In this case, the shields would be the most obvious spot. Start from the bottom and dab your way up. It really feels like cheating. If you have no pigments, I would advise you to try some. For someone who has only the traditional acrylics, but want to try to create something like the thing we do here, I would advise you to start out with a tube of black oil paint and a reddish pigment, like this brown iron oxide. Small side note, I recently got this bottle of Nuge, which, if it does what it says on the bottle, really could be an option for those that does not really want to get into this whole oil-based territory. I have not tried it yet, but if you would be interested in me comparing the two, oils and Nuge, trying to do the same thing with some other little batch of fellows, please let me know, and I will probably do that, at least. I can't believe it's not oil wash. We'll see about that. Finally, it's time to base. Today, I felt like trying some crackle paint, but that's by no means necessary. If you do that, or something similar, let it dry before the next step. Add a few random dots of PVA glue and spread it out using an old brush. People often tell you to water it down first, but it's fine to apply it straight out of the bottle. Just use a moist or wet brush to spread it out and you should be fine. Sprinkle on a bit of mixed sand and gently push it down, into the glue. Regular sand stolen from the playground is my favorite, as it's not too uniform. You can also throw in a bit of coconut fiber or similar if you have. Whatever you decide to use, it follows the same process as the sand. Whenever you feel you got enough fancy stuff going on, you stack on a load of gaming grass, give it a slight push and move on to the next. I do 4 at a time, which usually provides a steady flow. When they reach the end, they are dry, you pick them up, rinse the excess of the edges, turn it upside down and give it a good flick. Or 2 or 3. When they are all dry, give them a run of something darkening. I usually use dark streaking grime, as it happens to be of no other use for me, but to keep down the number of products used in this video, I'll once again use the thinned down black oil paint. Here you should really not care too much about the ratios, as an uneven coverage will just make it look more natural. But I do advise you to start beneath the miniature and taint the edges the least. If this was when I almost finished my last army in the end of the previous millennia, I would say, now paint the rim of the base goblin green. Now, I will not, and you can finish the base with whatever color you find appropriate. These modern times. The bases can obviously be done in any way, but there is some thought about why this way specifically. I do not consider these miniatures to be actual Grimdark. That in my view requires a bit more artistic skill. But they are grim and dark enough to support some proper Grimdark characters or units, while still being easy to produce and box arty enough to tie in the army with the common aesthetics of the Warhammer Fantasy. The bases are the bridge between these Boxdark miniatures and whatever green fantasy field you will find yourself on. In the end, this is not the greatest paint job I've done. I'm actually way more proud of the troll I did last time, or the orc marines I did at some point. They were really nice. Or the guys I converted to Phobos marines, is that right? Is that a thing you can be? Anyway, that's not the point of these guys. They're supposed to be a unit looking, decent or above at tabletop range. And as such, I think they do a really decent job. Especially compared to the effort to paint them. I never thought it would take such long time to, describe something as simple as this. in the end it's pretty much paint your miniature, dirty it down and add some finishing touches. That's it. And all of these steps are really fault tolerant. I mean, they're really forgiving. You can do them, you know, a few brush strokes here and there over whatever time frame you fancy, and they don't really require any sort of high precision or big mental load. So I think that's kind of useful, because if you want to get through an entire army worth of troopers, you have to relax as well, because, you know, whatever you try to achieve, don't forget to enjoy your hobby.